Chapter 4, Hired Out. In the summer of 1826, Harriet was 6 years old and by plantation standards, big enough to work. She carried water to the field hands and listened to their rhythmical singing, watched how the movement of their hands, their bodies was paced to the rhythm of the song. She was old enough to have a sense of family. She enjoyed being with her father and her mother, her brothers and sisters. They were 10 children now, either living in the cabin because they worked on the master's plantation or else living so near it that they could visit Ben and Old Rit. That year in the fall, a woman drove up to the big house in a wagon. She went inside and stayed for quite a while. Almost as soon as she arrived, word of what she wanted was relayed through the quarter. This woman who had come to see the master, she wanted to hire one of the master's slaves, preferably a girl, and young because she couldn't pay very much. The woman said that any of the little ones running around the cabins would do. The house slave who brought this whispered news to the quarter said that the woman wasn't quality. She was barely a cut above poor white folks when compared to the master. She was a weaver, the wife of a man named James Cook, a man who hunted and trapped for a living. Before 6-year-old Harriet knew what was happening, she was seated in the wagon beside the strange white woman who was now her mistress. She had been hired out by the master, Edward Brodess. Mr. James Cook was going to pay him a small sum a month for the services of Harriet. Harriet sat in the wagon, frightened, listening to the clop-clop of the horses' feet. They kept going farther and farther away from the quarter on the plantation, where she had been born and brought up. They went through the woods along an old road called a rolling road, though she did not know it. These roads were made in the days when tobacco was the chief crop on the eastern shore, and the hogshead of tobacco was rolled down to the wharves, and the boat landings and the roads thus made still bear the name Rolling Road. When the wagon finally stopped near a house, Harriet was disappointed in it. It was not like the big house. It was built of logs, just like the cabins in the quarter, but at least it was near a river, though she never knew the name of the river. Once she got inside, she found it had more than one room, and it had an upstairs. She had never been inside a house where people had a separate room in which they slept, for she had never been in the big house. There was no reason why she should. Even Old Rit didn't go there unless she was sent for. Mrs. Cook was a weaver. She spent most of the day in front of a big loom, head bent, arms moving back and forth. Harriet was supposed to help her. She stood for hours, winding yarn, her hands clumsy, unaccustomed to the job she had to do. The thread catching on the rough places on her fingers. The air was filled with fuzz and lint, so she kept sneezing and dropping the yarn. It seemed to Harriet that the clatter of the loom and the wear and the thump of spinning wheel went on day and night too. It confused her. She longed to be back in the quarter, in the cabin with Ben and Rich. She was afraid. She was lonesome. She hated the inside of the house. She slept in the kitchen, in a corner near the fireplace. Toward morning, when the fire went out, she slept with her feet tucked in and under the warm ashes because it was so cold at night. These people fed her scraps of food, much as they might have fed a dog. The woman said Harriet was clumsy, slow, no help at all, so the man set her to watching his trap lines. He had his traps set for muskrats. It was cold by the river, but Harriet didn't mind. It was quiet there. She was away from the clatter of the loom. She could breathe without getting her mouth and nose full of lint. As she walked the length of Crook's trap line, she saw an occasional gunning skiff, heard the wild, free crying of water birds, watched them fly up, wings spread wide. She learned to stand still on the bank of the river, and thus she saw the muskrats swimming, noses above water, watched them dive. She discovered the burrows they made in the bank, built with mud and bits of straw. By careful watching, she was able to distinguish the dark brown fur of a muskrat near the burrow, though they were the same color as the mud along the bank. One morning, she woke up coughing, eyes watering, feeling sick, hot, utterly miserable. Mrs. Cook said that slaves are always pretending to be sick in order to avoid work. That young as Minty was, she too had learned to slack off on her work. They seemed to be born knowing how to do this. So James Cook sent Minty out to inspect his trap lines. She stumbled along, head down, vision blurred by the watering of her eyes. She wasn't crying, but her eyes kept filling up with tears. The water in the river was so cold that she shuddered as she waded along the edge. She had to wade to see if the traps had been sprung. She bent over, shivering, examining a trap, not liking the scaly look of the tails of the muskrats, and yet not liking to see them caught in the traps. They wouldn't swim anymore, wouldn't dive anymore after they were caught. They had an unpleasant musky smell, but she still didn't like to see them held fast in the trap. When she went back to the house, a small bent over figure, shivering and shaking, it was obvious that she was really sick. Mrs. Cook got a blanket and threw it over her, wondering audibly what was wrong with Minty. She was so sick that old Rit heard about it and went to Edward Brodes and asked him to take Minty away from Cook's to let her come home where Rit could look after her. The master consented. He was fond of old Rit and he did not want to lose Harriet if he could help it. Sometimes there in the quarter, when they nursed themselves, they got well. They all seemed to have an inexplicable knowledge of the curative power of the roots and herbs that grew in the woods and the meadows. Rit nursed Harriet back to health. It was 6 weeks before she was really well. She had the measles. Because of the wading in the cold water of the river, she developed bronchitis. Rit kept giving her a hot, bitter brew made from the root of a plant that Ben brought back from the woods. There was always a huskiness in Harriet's voice after that. It stayed there for the rest of her life, an undertone that made her singing voice memorable. It lent an added timbre to her speaking voice. As soon as Harriet recovered, was once more playing with the young children, running and laughing, singing, listening to stories told by the old folks, the master sent her back to the house of James Cook. Rit grumbled about it, first to herself and then to Ben, and when he came home from the woods, Minty's back at Cook's, she said. He nodded, neither approving nor disapproving. She thought he already knows it. Probably word got to him in the woods. They are poor kids, she said. Not much better than white trash. Can't afford to own any slaves. Can't even afford to hire full-grown ones. So they take Minty. He said calmly, well, at least, Rit went on, her voice raised, they get her for almost nothing. About all she cost them is for her food, and there ain't much of that from the look of her when she came back to the quarter. Nothing but skin drawn over bones, no meat on her at all. Ben said, maybe she'll learn to be a weaver. Maybe she won't. Rit replied sharply, as though he were arguing with her. That's another thing. Quality don't work at nothing like that. The wives don't work and they don't give the orders. Shows that kind of folks the cooks are. She gives the orders. She works at the weaving. Weaves other folks' clothes for them. Then she stopped talking and sighed, thinking, of course, if Minty did learn to weave, it would be good. She'd never know the bite of the overseer's whip. Never know what it felt like to hold a hoe in rough work, hardened hands. Never give off the choking stink of the field hand. She said, hopefully, maybe she'll learn to be a weaver. Ben nodded. Perhaps, he said cautiously. If not a weaver, something else. She's smarter and all the rest put together. When Minta or Minty, whose Christian name was Harriet, went back to the Cooks, she soon learned that she was to stay indoors and learn to weave. She was not to walk Crook's trap line anymore. She felt like the muskrats. One moment she had seen them diving and swimming in the river, and then suddenly, click, they were caught fast in the trap. She remembered that some of them had fought to free themselves, tearing fur and flesh to get free. She decided that she simply would not learn to weave. She would not. She hated being inside the house with the loom and the spinning wheel and the endless hanks of the yarn. There was always lint in the air. She was always cold. She did not get enough to eat. She wanted to go home where she could be outdoors. The woman that she called her mistress was always cross. She kept telling her that she was stupid, stupid, stupid. And so finally, Crook's wife sent Harriet back to the Brodes plantation. She said that she was unteachable, intractable, hopelessly stupid. Early in the 19th century, the dream of freedom had begun spreading through the slave cabins on all the plantations. Almost every night, somewhere in the South, a slave slipped away from the quarter. They hid in swamps. They walked incredible distances. Some of them reached the north and freedom. Others were caught and brought back in chains. There were few plantations that could boast that they had never had a slave run away. By 1826, there were so many fugitive slaves living in Canada that plantation owners in Maryland and Kentucky persuaded Henry Clay, then Secretary of State, to ask the Canadian government to work out a plan whereby these fugitives worth thousands of dollars could be lawfully returned to their owners. The Americans waited eagerly for an answer. It was a long time coming, and when it finally arrived, it was most unsatisfactory. The Canadian government stated that the request of American Secretary of State had been received, and that was all. There was no suggestion made as to how American slave owners could obtain the slaves who had taken refuge in Canada.